dedicated to the Cleveland punk scene, a scene that planted its flag in the 1970s and that flag still stands today. You'll hear from the bands, the characters, the contributors, the Lake Rats, the Gypsies of the Dead Man's Curve, and the dwellers of the East, West, and South Side. We let them tell the story like it isn't like it was. There's no holding back. What it was ClePunk.
But so anyway, let's talk about your radio shows a little bit. How'd you get started at WCSB, and what was that all about?
Again, I'll credit to John Pekovic. I was at Tri-C West for I don't know how long. Well, from 84, 85, 86. Just at that point, all I was doing was re-enrolling to use the photo studios there and keep printing. And John's like, "You're wasting your time. Why don't you go to Cleveland State?" And I'm like, okay. And he's like, and you should join the radio station. I'm like, okay. And I knew of WCSB at the time. Obviously, we were all listening to it. I was listening to Sadie Smagola and Doug Gillard and a whole bunch of other people on WCSB. And so I applied. That was the fall of 87. And I remember they had like a 2-page application you fill out, and I wrote down all this stuff in it about what I did and what I wanted to do on the air and what kind of radio show I wanted to do. And I remember that years later, when I was actually on the executive staff of the team of the station, I found my application and the notes that the people at the time had written on it, and they wanted me to join the station for reasons that surprised me. Like, they all knew who I was and what I'd done in the scene and thought I'd be a good addition, which it wasn't the music they cared about. They just thought, I was a doer, I suppose. So I joined in 87. Small world. Jody Sosna was my mentor, because at the station, when you join, you go through a training program of like 4 weeks of how to use the equipment. And then you're put on air with another DJ for 6-8 weeks to train you to be live on the air. Jody Sosna today lives here in North Carolina, and through her, I bought this house. She's a real estate agent. So that's how small a world it is.
That's fast again, yeah.
So that's how I come to Cleveland State. I was working a night job at Arini's in Middleburg Heights, 4 days a week. And I remember my first semester at Cleveland State, I was trying to go to school full time and work almost full time the night shift. And I didn't plan my schedule well. And it turns out one day I sat in one of my classes, I'm so tired, and I just graphed what my schedule was for the week. And I found that I was only sleeping 5 nights a week because I kept flip-flopping between the day shift and night shift. And that's why my health was deteriorating so bad. But we fixed that. And eventually, well, of course, the first thing I wanted to do was an afternoon punk show, and I wanted to do an hour of local music because I wanted to focus on all the bands I've been seeing in the punk hardcore vein of things, the experimental, the alternative types of bands, and that just because I loved it so much. And I now remember one day I'm doing my show, and who walks in the studio? Charlotte Pressler. She was a member of the station, and she's got some 45s for me. And she says, "Here, you can borrow these for a little while." I'm like, "Oh, great." And I'm looking through them, and one of them was the Electric Eels. It was the Agitated single. And I'm like, never heard of them. Don't know who they are. Put this on. I'm like, this is better than Louie Louie. Agitated is such a great song. It should have been like the next Louie Louie. And I loved it. And after that, I just, one of the joys of being entranced with the whole Cleveland music thing is then you become like this archaeologist, and you want to go back and who are these bands? Who were the German Shepherds? They were a band out of Youngstown, who were, and we had one cartridge of a song by the Easter Monkeys, who by then had broken up. And it was a recording of Underpants that was really cool that they had made in their living room, apparently. So, there was like this treasure hunt to find these gems. And then it turns out over the years that the Electric Eels recorded a lot of stuff. And all of it today is freely available. well, sort of freely
And
available.
they
You
have
can,
a great library. Oh my God, just
yeah.
going in there, I would be lost just in their, vinyl collection right there.
Oh, at the
Then
station, yeah,
guitars and things like that, right?
yeah, yeah. Yeah, and just always looking for ways to expand it. And then, of course, when bands are putting out new material, which is something that goes on to this day, and there are these lineages, these small lineages within the Cleveland music scene, one group to the next, one artist to the next, one technique. Like the tortured wind instrument is something the Vivians did, is something the Death of Samantha did, is something the Easter Monkeys did.
Just a definite Cleveland sound, isn't there?
It really is.
Throughout.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
I could tell right away, like I could pick something up like that and go, they got to be from Cleveland. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
It's the humbucker pickups. It really is. None of them played Fenders. They all played Gibsons. That's as a guitar player. That's my that was my theory, is that you could always tell a Cleveland guitar, especially in the late '70s when I was really kicking around with all those guys and the Pagans and that bunch, and you could always hear their guitar. I think they were always trying to be what Cheetah was doing in the Dead Boys, and they just had that sound. It was just the way it worked. But it was you had 3 or 4 different shows, right? I mean, you were at night, then you went to WERE. Lord knows what you did there. I mean, I have no idea.
Oh, it was all like who kind of situations. So Wainstead all night. I probably should comment on that briefly. I'm doing, how that happened was, as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to do an afternoon show, punk and local. And the slot opened up, I believe it was Tuesdays, 12:30 to 3 p.m. And afternoon shows are in great demand. People want them because you want to be on in the daytime. And I told the program director, Chris Coffran, I said, look, you've got this 4 to 7 a.m. slot on Thursday night that's open, but you can't fill it. So I will fill that if you give me Tuesday afternoon also. He's like, okay, deal. So I landed Tuesday afternoons, and I started doing what I actually thought was 3 to 7, not 4 to 7. But Bill Gottlieb was the programmer on from 1 to 4, and he was like, sure, you want to start at 3? I get to go home earlier, right? That's late. So I was on 3 to 7, and I was just calling it Wake Up with Steve Wainstead at that time because I didn't care. It was a disposable, like, I'm just filling the airtime for a few hours, and I'll call it whatever because I didn't care what I would do with it. And so I started doing that. Not long after, Bill Gottlieb decided he would give up the 1 a.m. slot. And I said, well, I'll fill that. And so then it was 1 to 7 a.m. And then it became Wainstead all night. And then it just stuck, right? And it continued to be this time slot of 6 hours where who cares what I do? It's the middle of the night. There's nobody listening. It's crazy. So I was
there's a lot of meth heads in Cleveland.
There was a metal DJ on our station, Mitch Macho. What's Mitch Macho's name? It'll come to me. He was one of our metal DJs. I remember coming in one night. This is when Bill Gottlieb was still doing the 1 a.m. slot. And Mitch was doing a night guard duty shift somewhere downtown. And so Bill called him on the air, and Mitch did this impersonation of Axl Rose, which was pretty convincing. And they were just doing this like stupid, ridiculous interview, faking it. And I'm like, that's hilarious. And then at some point after that, I'm like, hey, Mitch, you want to do this again? And he's like, yeah, sure. And so I remember the first time I interviewed him as Axl Rose, late night on the air, I got this call from some guy who was just in anguish. He's like, dude, I'm telling you, that's not Axl Rose. And I'm like, I'm sure he is. It sounds just like him. He's like, no, I swear to God, that is not Axl Rose. It was priceless. And eventually I started getting calls from 2 people, Rick Gilmore, the late Rick Gilmore, may he rest in peace. Brain cancer took him at age 47. And then Bazooka Joe, who I still see on Facebook. He does a wedding DJ thing now. Bazooka Joe had a night shift at a different Reenies store than mine out in Strongsville. And he was the crew chief. And so he decided every night that WCSB would be put on the PA system in the grocery store all night long. And his whole crew had to listen to whatever was on the station. Well, that happened to be me. And he and Gilly first got into this like exchange of phone calls. I started taking calls on the air, and they would like take jabs at each other. And it snowballed from there into really this whole format that Wainstead All Night had become, where I would read the police blotters from the Sun newspapers. I would take calls on the air. At some point, a bunch of teenagers from Lakewood and some other area high schools caught on the fact that you can call this radio show on late Thursday night and you can swear on the air and he can't stop you from it. And they thought this was like the cat's pajamas. So I remember in like the second year of the show, it became this nightmare of kids calling all the time. But you know, one of those kids today is the founder of the Melt chain of restaurants in Ohio, in Cleveland. They've sent me letters, like people have sent me letters years on, like, I listen to your show every Thursday night, and it was like this big thing in my life, you know, that opened up possibilities for me. And that's quite humbling to hear that. Amazing. Anyway, I talked too long about Wainstead All Night, but the whole funny thing about that show was it was disposable. Like I just didn't, it's like the whole thing I wanted to do was be on the daytime to push Cleveland music and push punk rock and hardcore and new music. And it was Wainstead All Night that everybody remembers.